What's up, YouTube? We are talking tendinopathy and understanding golfer's elbow today. So if you've been suffering like I have, I've had it in the past, and this is the man that helped me get through it, then you're not going to want to miss this episode. So stick around because we're going deep. Hi everyone, in case we haven't met, my name's Rad Burmeister. I'm one of the co-founders of Unity Gym and co-creators of the UMS, the Unified Movement System, where we take driven people and turn them into superhumans. And the reason we get such amazing results with our members and our online community is that we've created a program that has a balance between strength and flexibility. If you want to know how we do it, you can get started by downloading one of our free blueprints, either the flexibility blueprint, the strength blueprint, or the nutrition blueprint. All are linked in the description of this video. As always, I'm joined by physio and all-round good guy, Phil White. How are you, buddy?
Very well. Yeah, this is a big one, I think. Like, this has been a long time coming. I've sort of stalled a bit on it because it's kind of such a big topic that I really want to get right. But I think today is a good time to just get into the discussion about it. Golfer's elbow is huge in this gym, and I know in the online community it's the most popular episode, like
injury
video.
Yeah.
Video
on
the
video,
Unity page.
YouTube
There's
channel,
the old program that Yanni put together about 4 years ago for it has got over 170,000 views. So there's clearly a lot of people out there who want to know how to get through this, and so I'm excited to kind of do a bit of an update. And today we'll go through, I guess, a bit of a recap on the tendinopathy and how it differs between lower body and upper body, and the way to get through this. So it's
awesome.
gonna be good.
Yeah. Well, let's get straight into it. Talk us through it, Phil. How does it differ from lower body and upper body?
Yeah. So if you remember from earlier in the week, the big things about tendinopathy is it's always coming down to a load management issue. And so when you're thinking about load management, it's basically you can look at macro load and micro load. So macro load is basically how much training you're doing. Are you going to the gym lots? Do you have a manual job as well? Maybe you're doing yoga as well, where you may not think of it as like a gym training, but you're loading up your forearms quite a lot. All of those things that accumulate and become your big sort of macro loading of that structure. So that's really key for tendinopathy, and it's often these big changes that we do that end up causing us grief. So your body kind of will adapt to things over time, but tendons especially take a little bit more time than your muscles to adapt. So it's really key to understand that the big reason why tendinopathy happens is because you overload. So that's the number one key thing to remember. And so when I said there was macro loading, so that's that big picture sort of stuff. And then there's also micro loading as well, as about how you load up, if you think kind of more the biomechanics of how you're loading up that structure. So there's also micro loading things that come into it. So for the knee, it came down to if you're getting into positions of excessive knee bend where you're getting compression and loading. So with the forearm, we'll go into a bit of that as well. So in terms of the things that really set off tendinopathy, as I mentioned earlier in the week, people may have forgotten because they might have been wowed by Ben Pekelski's great talk on the weekend. I loved being in and listening to that. But the big things that really set it off is that energy storage and release, which is basically using your tendons like springs, which you can imagine is probably a bit different in the forearms as it is to the lower body. So it becomes like a slightly, this is one thing where it really varies, where your Achilles is almost like a big spring and your patella to some extent is as well. But whereas unless you're probably Simon Monster or Daniel Vandal doing those crazy jumping, stalls on the landing on their arms, it's unlikely that in the forearm we're doing quite as much of that energy storage and release. But the compression component as well, which aggravates tendinopathies, really comes into the forearms. So,
cool.
So that's that big picture.
Yeah, right. Okay, cool. Well, it's a bit of an injury. I was speaking to one of our members this morning who was presenting with early symptoms of tendinopathy. He was talking about how he was getting pain up his arm on the outside when he was doing deadlifting. And I was talking to him about this concept of how long it takes for the tendons to actually go through a phase of adaptation from, in reaction to the stimulus of lifting weights, which is just so hard for people to understand. And it's something that I didn't even understand until recently. Yeah, it's. I think if you can get it early, my advice, and we'll see what you say. But if you start to feel those symptoms, try to don't stop, but try to reduce the load so that you're not getting worse, and allow those tendons to go through that adaptation. Allow it to take its time and catch up.
Yeah, that adaptation time is key, because it really does impact how quickly you'll be able to get into moving forward in your training, because you get strong quite quickly from neural adaptations that I've talked about before. So basically being able to engage larger motor units, which motor units are parts of your muscle that, basically if you have a flight or flight sort of situation, or a whole lot of different factors, having coffee, caffeine, these sort of things can mean that you can unlock some strength that's always there, but just by neurally you can tap into that. And one of the first things that happens, really relevant for these guys who are doing their 28-day intensive here at the gym, is that when you start training, that's the first thing that kicks off, and you start to get much stronger just from getting used to actually
neuromuscular
exactly
activity. Yep.
So you get this huge increase in strength, but your tendons have been kind of used to whatever load you've been putting them through, which for a lot of people, if you
adapted at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they're not at all adapted to putting load through, and then suddenly you're getting all this extra muscular strength, and then instead of maybe one day a week, if that, kind of doing some guilt push-ups, so that would be the only load you're kind of getting through your forearms, and then coming into doing, people, when human nature is such that when you get excited about something, you go pretty hard. So going from maybe 1 session a week to 5 a week can be quite intense. So it is that the connective tissue there, your tendon, that really can take a little while to catch up. So that's why with the gym, it's a real, it's all about kind of having that long-term thinking and slowly building things up, instead of maybe like a typical CrossFit, some CrossFit approach, which would be go as hard as you possibly can, get your sweat on, you're going to lose weight by working hard. That's where there lies injury.
Yep. Yeah, and I think I think the first thing that I'd say in this talk is the best thing to understand is to try to identify these things before they become a problem and before it becomes a really big issue. And it's I was talking to our member this morning, and it's probably one of the hardest things that people go through, because I certainly went through it, which is this idea where you have this goal, you want to be able to do, for me it was a one-arm pull-up. I really wanted to get to a one-arm pull-up, and so I started doing all the programming for it and working towards it, and I could feel myself getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and I was getting there. And then when the symptoms of golfer's elbow started coming on, I was like, well, fuck this, I'm getting stronger, I must be able to get through this if I keep going. Yeah. Whereas the solution, unfortunately, is that you have to just allow those strength increases that you initially felt to take a back seat, and you've now just got to kind of let everything. What's the word I'm looking for? What's the word that starts with C, where everything comes together and
comes together?
That's not it. Anyway, maybe it'll come to me in a minute.
Yeah.
But basically, you just need to allow all this strength and everything that you've been working on to
coalesce.
It's
combine.
As soon as it
yeah,
as soon as
I
it comes.
get the point. Yeah.
But it needs to it basically, your whole body needs to adapt. It's not just that ability to produce the strength, the connective tissue and everything, which I really didn't understand until I got tendinopathy. I didn't understand the way it all worked and the way that everything went through this adaptation. And if you can do that, if you can understand it, if you can accept that, you've got these big strength goals, and if you can just allow your body to, adapt to which means that you've kind of got to put the brakes on from just getting stronger and stronger and stronger every week, and just do some consistent training and allow that volume to produce the results in the tendons and everything, then you can avoid it in the first place.
100%. And that's why I'm so glad that we're doing this off the back of the goal setting in the first week of this year. And then I think a lot of the pain science stuff is pretty relevant to this, but particularly that goal setting. If you have that kind of long-term thinking in mind, then it's much easier to slow things down a little bit, and just kind of think about, there's no point in, if your goal is to do a pull-up by the end of the year, and then by the end of January, or by the end of February, you've given yourself an injury that stops you from training for 3 months, then you're not going to get that goal. But if you can slowly build things up and, 1% a day ends up being 365% by the end of the year. Like, it's pretty huge differences by just going up really slowly and giving your body time to adapt.
Well, it's really different, and it means that sometimes, because so many times the markers for success with weightlifting are that each workout you put a little bit more weight on the bar, and I think that if you feel this like my advice to Will this morning, and what I would say to anybody now, if you're deadlifting and you get to a point where you start feeling pain down the forearms, my advice would be back the weight off just a little bit, allow yourself to experience a little bit of pain, but stay at that same weight for several weeks and just allow your body to adapt to that and just build up some tolerance to it, and then go up slowly from there.
Yeah, I think you'd be familiar with like Coach Summers' work, I imagine. From yeah. So very, he's a ex-US team gymnastics coach, and he has one way of his kind of strength training method is you basically give someone a weight that's quite challenging, and then they work up until the point where that weight is just so easy that they can do it for 20 reps, and then they do like another significant jump, and then do it for 20 reps, and do it for it might be up to 3 months, where you just get so comfortable your body has that time to adapt to that stimulus, and then you move on to the next. Now, I think I'm not 100% on board with his way of doing it. Like, he does really quite big jumps, and I think there's sort of certain ups and downs, which is probably another episode, but I think that idea of just being comfortable doing that same weight for a while, and getting, having those different markers. So instead of necessarily what number you're lifting, the how much weight's on there, maybe it's how you feel while you're doing it. Maybe it's, the ease in which you can do it, doing it more reps, reducing your rest time, all those other things that you can find this tangible feedback to feel like you're improving, but instead of completely overloading your system for the sake of that dopamine hit.
Yeah, and sorry, Cracked Glass is asking, is the word coagulate? It's not.
Plenty of C words though, hey? That's all right. We'll move on.
Anyway, look,
it's totally against human nature though, hey? You just want to.
Yeah, you just want to keep putting weight on, and you want to just keep getting better, and that's what I did, and it just killed me. It destroyed me, because I got to a point with my golfer's elbow where I was proper fucked. I could not grab onto a barbell and even initiate the first sort of 15% of elbow flexion in a pull-up. It was just agony, and it stopped me dead in my tracks. It's one of the most frustrating injuries I've ever had. And so that's the first thing. If you start to feel the onset of it, you need to seriously reevaluate what you're doing with your training, reevaluate your goals, and you need to, I would say, the biggest thing you need to do is you need to take a breath and say, I am not going to achieve that goal as quickly as I thought I would. And you need to become at peace with it, because if you don't, you are going to wreck yourself. And once you accept that, once you first say, okay, this thing that I thought I was going to do in 3 months, it is now going to be more like a year, and you just accept that where you're at right now is you're not at the point of conditioning the muscles and the nervous system to get stronger, you're at the point of conditioning the tendons. And if 100%. You can do that, maybe you can avoid the tendinopathy in the first place.
Yeah, which might seem really demoralizing, but then you can always see injuries as opportunities to work on some other areas of your training. So, instead of just being hell-bent on getting that one-arm pull-up, then, you went into probably doing a bit more lower body stuff.
It made me more flexible than I've ever been, because I went into doing flexibility training.
This week you did your, Van Damme splits between, what do you call that move again?
The Van Damage, the deficit straddle up.
Yeah, so he's got a deficit straddle up, which if you haven't seen, he's go on Instagram and check out the video of Rad doing it early in the week. That's a massive achievement, and maybe if he'd just gone on that one-armed pull-up quest and all else had kind of fallen away, then if he just got I can't do a one-arm pull-up, I can't get my goals, so I'm not gonna, and then tap out of training, then you wouldn't have been able to get that amazing. So
no, that's exactly right. Yeah. You just there's different ways to do it, but it's not just that. It's you have to, if all your training, all you're doing is training for, a quick fix and a short-term goal, then you're not watching a channel that really supports that. We're all about longevity and about training for a longer life of training, and
which I 100% find really hard. Like, I'm someone who just wants to get out there and
I'm the same.
push hard.
I'm the same, but I've had to learn how to do it,
exactly.
man, because in the last couple of years, I just had I had a couple of really bad injuries that caused me to reshape myself. Look, we've got a couple of questions in here, which
but I just wanted to acknowledge that it is hard, and we're not just like, you should do this.
Yeah,
because
of course.
Right.
I've gone through it. I've gone through it myself, and you have to, so Crack Glasses is saying, is the pain due to inflammation of the tendon, or does the tendon itself get torn? So what we're talking about right now, the onset of it, and Phil can correct me in a sec, the onset of it is actually not tendinopathy, is it? That's actually where it's tendinitis. Is that right? Where it's...
I think we're just going to get our kind of words right here. We're throwing tendinitis out. We're just leaving that one behind because basically we're like... initially, they called it tendinitis because they thought it was this big inflammatory process, and that was kind of it. And then it went down the kind of... And then they sort of thought, oh, no, it's a degenerative change, so kind of like arthritis for your tendons, so we'll call it tendinosis. And I think let's just not use those words at all, because basically it becomes a bit irrelevant.
It's just tendinopathy.
So we're calling it tendinopathy. And so basically, as I've talked about before, there's all of your structures have a capacity, so think about it like a bucket, and then you have the load in which you put on it. You can think about like how much tap you're turning on turning on a tap. So basically, if you have conditioned your body to withstand, like to do a one-arm pull-up, you're going to need a bloody big bucket because you're turning on that tap super strong. So, but if you've just got in training and or for you, you're turning on that tap really strong, and maybe the bucket, so your capacity wasn't quite big enough, and then you overflow, and that is what we'd call an abusive load. So basically, tendinopathy starts from an abusive load, being where your body's like, hey, this is too much, we can't handle this amount of load, or, which might be one big intense sort of thing, or it might be accumulation of, if you were working on the tools after you do 2 training sessions a day, and then you're on the tools, the plumber, and you're twisting pipes, and like that kind of, even though it might be lower level, that accumulation can be another way of turning on that tap, so your bucket overflows and you get that abusive load. So then you get this really complicated pathway of both inflammatory processes and some other things that basically try and reinforce that area by sending down lots of collagen fibers that maybe don't quite, think of it kind of like a scab. Not quite like that, but you're sending the fibers that, if they were all lined up perfectly, they would make the structure stronger, but because of this kind of response from the body, it's basically just trying to patch up the area. And then to get past that, it takes a gradual sort of like a reduction, getting underneath that threshold of that abusive load, and then by loading up that tendon, encouraging that kind of patchwork to realign and become strong tendon again. So it's not exactly there is an inflammatory component to tendinopathies, but that's somewhat it's a bit of a debated topic. And then it's not exactly the tendon getting torn per se, like a muscle tear, but you can imagine these fibers that are non-contractile have got kind of overloaded, and then there's this tendinopathy process, which is it's sort of its own thing.
So to bring that into a more simplified explanation, maybe that you guys, our users, can really absorb and understand, is that I think the words that Phil used there, abusive load, is the really important thing to hone in on. Because let's talk about what I was doing, which was working on pull-ups. So my strength is going up. 1 week I can do 5 pull-ups, and the next week I can do 6 pull-ups, and then the next week I add 5 kilos and I can do 5 pull-ups, and then the next week I can do 6 pull-ups with 5. So my strength of the muscles and everything is going up, but the tendons aren't going through that same adaptation. And the abuse on the tendons is
but slower.
Much slower, yeah. So they're not they haven't caught up yet. So the abusive load going into those tendons is more and more and more and more. So you have to, when you're feeling those symptoms that are coming on, you have to respect that the strength of your muscles is going up, your tendons haven't caught up, and you need to back off and allow that time for the adaptation to occur.
Because it will happen if you give it an adequate stimulus. It'll happen over time. It just takes.
And that's what happened to me. It took the backing off, and it did work. So
the reason I went kind of into that, I guess, I tried to make it a bit understandable there, but I think it's important to understand that it's if it was just inflammation, then people would treat it like you would any other sort of inflammatory thing with well, actually now it's gone away from rest, ice, compress, and elevate to peace and love, but that could be a whole another episode of which is the new you don't actually ice inflamed things, but again, rabbit hole that I'm gonna try and avoid. But yeah, so it's not just an inflammatory process. When you settle down, it will be back to normal because it's going through these changes that we then put in the umbrella term of tendinopathy. And yeah, again, it's not that one test. I think it's really important to understand that it really, the way that you get past tendinopathy is by treating it like a tendinopathy. And if you treat it like inflammation or you treat it like a muscle tear, then you won't get very far.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think considering the amount of the idea that you were saying this is probably going to be a couple of shows and the amount of information that there is for this, I think we should probably save the how you actually now treat the tendinopathy for the next show. What
I think we'll go a bit into the kind of basics so we can give that overview of how to do it. And then maybe for the next show, we can go into, like an example of a program that, or an example of how you put it together.
So this is we've covered what it is now and what you can do to prevent it if you feel.
One thing we didn't actually say is what, because you were talking about the member of the gym who had the pain on the outside of the arm. We haven't actually talked about what golfer's elbow is in particular versus tennis elbow, which is maybe an important place to kind of go here. So instead of tennis and golfer's elbow, technically we'd call it medial elbow tendinopathy and lateral elbow tendinopathy. And basically golfer's is the medial one, so on the inside of your arm there,
it's where you feel it right in here.
Yeah, basically up into underneath the elbow for all those podcast listeners. And then the tennis elbow is on the outside of the arm. So if you were to stand up against a wall, it would be the bit that's kind of standing up against, hitting up against the wall. So just to be quite clear, there's two very different ththings, and that's what it is. And you might have heard some other names for it, which is like epicondylalgia or the epicondylitis. All of these things are the same thing. And basically, it's the common flexor origin. So all the muscles that flex your wrist and flex your fingers and move your hands, they are in the forearm. So most of them come up and attach into just below your elbow there in what's called your common flexor origin. And that origin is basically where the muscles attach into the bone. And when muscles attach into bone, that's what a tendon does. It's a muscle attachment to a bone, which is different to a ligament, which is bone to bone. And then on the outside, you've got a common extensor origin, and that's the common place for your tennis elbow or the lateral elbow tendinopathy. Yeah.
And generally speaking, the golfer's elbow is in the gym at least is usually more felt when you're in a supinated position.
It's certainly.
And pulling, is that
it certainly
right?
can be. So often it's an overload of pulling, but then people will really find it as well when they're going into sort of handstand positions, because when you go into that wrist and finger extension, you're getting a stretching, like a stretch through that muscle, which when you put quite a lot.
But in that stretch position, you're trying to flex. You're trying.
Yeah, but even passively as well. If you're going into a very heavily loaded in a handstand, even though you're meant to be fairly active, like that's quite intense and you're putting a lot of force through sort of end range there. And when we talked about compression before, when you get into muscles that are stretching, that can cause that compression that I talked about, which is quite aggravating for tendinopathies. So that's commonly when you feel it. So you get anything where you're really pulling hard, bicep curls, pull-ups, all of those things are generally your medial elbow, whereas the lateral elbow is with finger extension. And sometimes that can be with when you're doing grip like a deadlift, you're getting that kind of stretch and over. When you're bending your fingers into flexion, then you're loading up those muscles in a somewhat stretched position, and that can kind of set it off. But the reason actually why, I think it's kind of interesting to know why they are called golfers and tennis, because it's quite different to what, when you think about golf and tennis, you don't think massive pulling or handstands or whatever. But basically, if you're doing a backhand in tennis, the muscles also act as a shunt for the elbow joint, which basically means help keep the joint together. So when you're gripping really hard on the racket and hitting the ball, it's doing all these kind of different jobs and stretched over the fingers, and then it's also trying to keep the elbow from gapping when you've got this strong force at the end of a long lever, and that is a way in which the elbow issues are pretty different to the lower body, where you've got this sort of extra shunting action, which is just this whole other load that you've got to try and deal with as well, which can complicate things. And with golf, the golf swing, you're getting exactly that same thing. Really long lever, so you're getting quite a lot, and you're applying a force to the end of that, and basically your medial tendinopathies are going to be from that shunting plus grip plus stretch. So not sure if this is like way too much detail for people, but I think it's really important to understand, which is going to be how we're going to be working through this going forward, is understanding all the different ways in which you aggravate tendinopathies and how to avoid them while still loading up the tendon and strengthening it. And I think it also helps to understand why maybe for these we don't just get in there and massage the area, because as I talked about so much with tendinopathies, if you they can get quite angry from compression. So like we did a bit of manual therapy for to help with yours, but that was always working on the forearm muscles far below the actual origin site, and the origin site can get pretty angry if you get into there. So you can see how it's really important to understand when we're loading it, how we can load it in the best way to make it strong without aggravating it.
Yep. Yeah, cool. All right, are we ready for the key insight for today?
Mate, it's all key insight. I'm just dropping insights all over the place here. So
the key insight that I want you to take away from today, the key insight for dealing with golfer's elbow and tennis elbow, is to try to prevent it before it actually gets to a point where it becomes really bad. So, and the way you do that is that when you experience the onset of the pain and discomfort when you're doing exercises, so either on the inside of your forearms or the outside, you need to recognize what the abusive load that you're doing is and try to scale it back a little bit. Try to either scale back the load or scale back the intensity or the volume. There's all different things that you can do, but you do not stop doing you do not stop exercising. You do not stop stimulating those muscles from being used. And if you can do that, then and gradually build up the tolerance of the tendons, then to catch up to the muscles and to catch up to the nervous system, then hopefully you can prevent yourself from getting.
And that's such a key point that we haven't. That do not stop is such a key point that we talked quite a lot about with the knee. But yeah, when I talked about that capacity and load, the bucket and the tap analogy, if you totally turn off that tap, then your bucket's going to shrink down to a itty bitty little bucket, and then as soon as you try and get back into all this cool training you're doing, it's going to really struggle. So as we go into the exercise program to trying to get over this, you'll see that it is really all about just loading up your tendons to the right sort of point.
Yep.
So I'll just quickly go through. Scott West has said, just went to see my physio 2 hours ago for this, and yes, I need to back off. Well identified.
Yep.
Doug Rousseauez, I struggle in pointing my elbow pits forward during exercises like push-ups or planches. There is no information about this issue out there. Are you feeling like golfer's elbow pain or tendinopathy pain while you're doing it? Is that the limiting factor, or is it more the coming from your shoulder or maybe even sort of your wrist mobility there? Be good to get a bit more information, and we can maybe talk to that in the next episode.
Yeah, maybe we can answer a bit of that.
Yeah, just leave a comment about what's holding you back, because that can kind of come from a whole bunch of different things, and it's unclear there if there's pain involved with that. And it said, and Scott just said, yes, that's why it's flared up from doing the more handstands. Yeah, that's
definitely.
So hopefully you can kind of see how, start to identify maybe areas in which you, like for some people with lateral elbow tendinopathy, it might be they play a lot of computer games and it's that clicking. Like that's a really common one which can set it off. So hopefully this information can just help you sort of identify parts, like times in your life when you don't really realize you're even kind of overloading things, and you actually are.
For sure. All right, thanks for tuning in, everyone. We're going to bring this one in for a landing on Monday with the tendinopathy, and we'll have some other juicy stuff to talk about next week. So make sure you tune in, where we're going to talk about strategies for how you can
keep sending those questions in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And check out the podcasts that I've been putting up every day. Any subscriptions would be, and especially reviews on Apple Podcasts would just be huge for us, kind of getting it off the ground. So please do that.
Awesome. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Health is about performance, not just body image.
You better be willing to accept what you're going to have to do to get there.
We'll start focusing on movement goals, strength goals, flexibility goals.
When you nail that skill, it's there forever.
The body image goal doesn't get you that far.
It's the consistency and frequency that's going to get you there. It's not the intensity.
There's no shortcuts to mastery and movement. Destination doesn't change overnight, but your direction will.
The gym is not the place to beat up the body that you hate. It's the place to build the body that you love.
We are the gym that teaches people how to move instead of just exercise, because we believe that health is about performance, not just body image.